This conference will now be recorded.
The words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Greetings, everyone. Another Connect the Dots session. This one's number 9, and it's closely connected with number 8, the literal Antichrist figure, because this next one is the Abomination of Desolation idea, and this is what is performed by him, at least in my way of looking at it. This future Antichrist figure will commit what the Bible calls the abomination of desolation. And there are a number of prefigures to this event by evil men. Antiochus, certainly, uh, Titus in 70 AD to some degree. But there is yet a future final fulfillment of this by the man of sin, the son of perdition, the Antichrist, that little horn, that wicked one, that oppressor, all the other names that he's called by. The beast is a big one. He performs an act in the temple, however that may manifest itself, however that temple idea and the resuming of their sacrificial system is allowed under this covenant in Daniel 9. We wait to see how that exactly what that looks like. But this Antichrist figure is going to commit a final act of rebellion, of uh, open manifestation of evil against the true God, declaring himself that he is God. We'll eventually get to that verse in 2 Thessalonians 2. It will be the ultimate defiant act of a human against God, because it is simply what happens on earth, the same spirit behind it of pride, of self seeking, of lofty ideas about himself. It's the same spirit that Lucifer had in heaven, because he will be cast down. Revelation 12. He knows he has a short time, 3.5 years. He will focus his full attention on his man on earth, the Antichrist, declare himself to be God or as God, and will try to work that out for 3.5 years. So this idea of abomination of desolation, it's a trigger event on a time clock, because we'll see it happens in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. It triggers the last 3.5 years. It's combined with the ending of sacrifices. It's combined with his death and resurrection event, Revelation 13. So many big things happen right in the middle of that 70th week. And this abomination of desolation idea is a big part of that. Now, before we look at the actual terminology and how it's traced through the Bible, um, if you want to do a good study on your own, because it really does add rich background to this idea of abomination of desolation, because we use that term, we immediately kind of set it apart from everything else as far as the actual words go. We think of a certain event yet future, but the idea of both the word abomination and the word desolation or desolate, these two particular words were used a lot leading up to the time of Daniel. If you look, just get a good concordance and look up these two words and the variations of them, you'll find multiple verses that use one or both of these words in the same general passage or group of verses in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And so these lay the groundwork for what the Lord leads Daniel to talk about, combining these two words together in a final act of defiance by the final Antichrist that Christ has to come and put a stop to, because it is so egregious, it is so horrible, it is so openly rebellious that Christ will come and put a stop to it. So before you actually study the term abomination of desolation, it would be good to just open your concordance and kind of glance through all the many verses in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel uh, that use one or both of these words. There's a lot of them. And so all of these informed Daniel. He was very familiar with this terminology, either as separate words or together, uh, because his mentors, his prophetic mentors, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, uh, were fond of these two particular words describing God's judgment on Israel, especially on Jerusalem and the temple. And so you put all those together in this idea of a final abomination of desolation being performed by an evil, wicked man in a temple setting. The groundwork was already laid by the prophets that preceded Daniel. And so he picks up on this and formulates it by inspiration, of course, by revelation, into a particular final example or act of this open defiance against God that we call the abomination of desolation. But without that background understanding, it loses a lot of its force, or it loses a lot of its richness. So I would encourage you to kind of do that on your own. It would take too much time. There are so many verses speak about both of those separately or together. But Daniel combines them by inspiration. And we're going to start in Daniel chapter 8. Of course, Daniel is in Babylon, and Daniel 8 is at the end of the Babylonian rule or empire before the Medes and Persians defeat them and take over. And so Daniel is already an elderly man. He has had a lot of great events in his life, visions and dreams and interpretations. And in this Daniel chapter 8, many would put this strictly in the past of the succeeding empires and how they're going to work themselves out in history. But this passage in Daniel 8 does tie in with passages in chapter 9, 11, and 12 of Daniel that lays the groundwork for it in his writings. So Daniel chapter 8 and verse 9, out of one of them came a little horn. And we see in chapter 7 and verse 8, that little horn, and 11:23 is the same as the Antichrist. So he's grabbing hold of this idea, whether he knew it was a particular figure way out in the future or not, or maybe in his mind applied to rulers during his lifetime or soon after. But as he goes on through the rest of his book, it develops into what we call the Antichrist. Daniel 8:9, and out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, toward the glorious land. Certainly would be prefigured in Antiochus, um, but more than Antiochus. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it came down, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. Revelation 12 uses that same kind of language. He even exalted himself. Now, this idea of self exaltation, self promotion, self pride, that kind of language is tied directly to the final Antichrist. So, whatever it might apply to Antiochus or Alexander the Great before him, uh, Titus after him in 70 AD, and so forth, um, there is a final expression of this spirit behind all of them. And the greatest example of this evil, prideful spirit will be in the final Antichrist. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. Now, that kind of language is used of the Antichrist. He's trying to set himself above Christ or in place of Christ, just like his father Lucifer did in the beginning. So the same idea of the seed of the serpent is trying to usurp the role of the seed of the woman. The false Messiah is trying to usurp the place of the true Messiah. And this is a conflict that goes all the way through the scriptures. It's really important to see side by side. And when you see this, as I did the session on the Antichrist figure, and I started out with Ezekiel 38:17, where we are told that all the prophets spoke of him, so that he is mentioned a lot more in the Old Testament scriptures than what you might realize. That helps us to understand a little bit better, or it helps us to resolve, in my mind, Daniel 9:26 that we'll get to in a minute, the two princes. Because the argument is it one prince, only the Messiah, or is it two princes, a good Messiah and an evil Messiah? But if you grab that concept, that central truth of Ezekiel 38:17, and you see that that principle is being worked out through the entire Bible, then that helps you accept more closely, I think, the idea that Daniel 9:26 is talking about two different princes. One is anointed by God. We know him as Jesus the Christ. And the other is anointed by himself or by his father Satan, and that's the prince who is to come. And I think with this with this overarching idea of the two seeds and of the Antichrist and of the true Christ working their way all through the scriptures, that's the foundation for reaching the conclusion I reach in Daniel 9:26. It's a little bit of a side note there, but I think it's important. He even exalted himself back in 8:11 as high as the prince of the host, and by him, this evil prince, this little horn of verse 9, by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. So I think this lays the groundwork for what we're going to get into in later chapters of Daniel, that this idea that this evil little horn will end the sacrifices. Certainly Antiochus did that to a large degree. But I'm trying to make the argument that there is a final expression of it leading to the return of Christ. And what you'll notice in these passages I'm reading, starting with this one, and this helps clarify again, are there two princes in Daniel 9 or just one, is that the this abomination of desolation idea that is kind of introduced here in Daniel and said in clearer language later, um, that uh, he is the one who also takes away the sacrifices. The one committing the abomination of desolation is the one ending the sacrifices. So that makes it difficult in my mind for those who say that ending the sacrifices in Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks is Messiah on the cross only, has no other application other than that, must then try to figure out why is the one taking away the sacrifices also the one committing the abomination of desolation. They're always tied together as almost a single event because they do happen, in my mind, right in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. So that's kind of laying a groundwork for what else I want to say on this subject. The next one we will look at would be in Daniel chapter 9 as it progresses through the book of Daniel. 9:27, of course, that's the famous 70 weeks prophecy. And it says, then he, and I take that back to the prince to come, verse 26, the true Messiah has been cut off, the beginning of verse 26. That's the end of the 69th week, or 483 years. But I think this verse, again, if you put it in a larger context, I think these are two princes that are the two persons, the faces of Genesis 3:15 and their seed. The Messiah is going to be cut off. That's Isaiah 53:8. He was cut off from the land of the living. That's at the end of 483 years. So we separate off the 70th by necessity, again, in the larger picture of the two comings of Christ. Because this prophecy of the 70 weeks, if you go back to verse 24, those 6 items, which is, I think, Daniel's rewording of his mentor's new covenant in Jeremiah 31 through 34. He's basically saying the same thing, different language, or maybe expanding on it some. But those items of verse 24 of Daniel 9 takes both comings of Christ to accomplish. And so, even though it was not well understood by everyone about the two comings of Christ separated by a long period of time, or we would say a long gap of time, then I think that in itself, connecting it to the two comings of Christ required to fulfill 924, lets us know that it's okay to put a gap between the 69th week, he is cut off, and therefore the 70th week is what connects it to the second coming of Christ, to fulfill all of verse 24. I hope I said that in a way that's clear, but I think it's important to put that gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. And one way to also show that is the use of till and until in verses 25 through 27, 3 different times, one in each verse. And the use of the word until uh, almost necessitates a gap because it's a word that simply means until some future event happens. It could be close or it could be far away. But the word until promotes the idea of a gap. And so verse 25, 26, and 27 uses that word 3 times. And then, so I make the he in verse 27 to be this prince to come, this evil prince, this imitation Christ. He's going to confirm. That's a good word, or it could mean to make strong, to make firm, or confirm is not a bad word because, in my mind, again, he will confirm a covenant that they already accept. That is their right to be a nation, their right to exist, first of all, which is a big one to overcome by their neighbors, a right to exist, a right to be a nation, and a right to be a nation in their own promised land. So that in their mind, that's the idea of what God made with them as a covenant with their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and through Moses and so forth, David. To them, that's central. That's what God's covenant to them is. Their right to exist, their right to be a nation, their right to be a nation in their own land, and added to that, their right to some access in some way to their own Temple Mount. Because without that, the picture is not complete. And so I think all that will be confirmed or agreed to by this prince to come. He won't like it. He immediately hates it. Chapter 11 goes on to describe he's going to immediately plot to undermine it, to do away with it, but he's buying himself time. And it takes 3.5 years. And then he finds a time and a way to break that covenant and to turn on them and try to destroy them. To me, it all makes real good sense. He shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. So, of course, the difficulty in making this in verse 26 only one prince, meaning Christ and what he did on the cross to end the sacrificial system, uh, you have to figure out when did he make a covenant for 1 week, for 7 years. Uh, and so many try a different form, different ways, but I don't see any time he made a covenant for 7 years, and I don't see a major ending event like some make it the stoning of Stephen or turning to the Gentiles. But the wording of this whole prophecy is that these 70 weeks are going to end with a major event. And as we will see in chapter 11 and 12, that major event is the resurrection of the dead and the coming of Christ, return of Christ, we would call it today. He shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the weeks, that's how we know that the 70th week is divided into two halves. He shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And the words there used, Hebrew word tamid, is simply the word used. It can mean daily, it can mean continual, but it was simply the word used for their regular daily sacrifices in the tabernacle and temple. So he purposely uses a word that they were familiar with that was used throughout their history of their regular daily sacrifices. And I think that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about some other kind. And on the wings of abomination, so it starts introducing this idea of abominations and desolation, desolate, that his predecessors, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, used often separately and together. Now he's kind of combining them. So we have the abomination of desolation connected with the ending of the sacrifices. So if there's only one prince in verse 26, when did Jesus commit what might be called an abomination of desolation? Some might make it his pronouncement of judgment at 70 AD and other things, but I think we're going to see it's not. Even until the consummation, end time language, second coming of Christ language, which is determined, that idea, the determined counsel of God regarding the timetable for the return of Christ, is at the end of Daniel's 70th week. Is poured out on the desolate. So Revelation 19, Christ comes back and pours out his own abomination of desolation upon the one who committed it 3.5 years earlier. But now it's actually turned against him, and he becomes desolate because he is an abomination. So I think that all fits. And then we'll go to chapter 11 of Daniel and verse 29. This again, this idea of at the appointed time. So there's a time clock being worked out in this 70th week, divided into two halves of 3.5 years each, also called 42 months, also called 1260 days, also called times, and half a time. But they are appointed times by God in his time clock. But he thinks he's doing this at a particular time. So God's behind the scenes working all this out. He shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter, for the ships from Kittim or Cyprus, the west, whatever naval powers that might be, shall come against him. So not everybody's aligned with him. He has people, at least after the first 3.5 years, and their eyes are open to who he is, he's going to have those who oppose him who are powerful. And the last 3.5 years is going to be continual battles, including what God is doing from heaven in the seals, trumpets, and bowls of wrath. So there's a lot going on from many different parties. Therefore, he shall be grieved. See, he doesn't like this opposition. He thought he had most everyone lined up, but he pushed it too far. As politicians and rulers often do, they They take what power has been given them and they keep pushing it further and further out. And he does until finally some stand up against him and return in rage against the holy covenant. See, he agreed to it in 927, but now he's trying to figure out a way uh, to break it. And he's going to back in verse 24. He devises his plans. Verse 25. They shall devise plans against him. In verse 28, while returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he's figuring out a way to break that 7-year agreement. And now he's figured out a way. In rage, he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. So lines are being drawn, decisions are made, people are deciding which side they will stand with. Forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away, see, the people of the prince, but it's him, he's the head of it, but he uses his armies and his people to help carry it out. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. So again, these two events are tied together, and it's always an evil prince doing both of them. And then that word forsake back in verse 30, and the idea of these verses, both before and after, I think are speaking about what Paul calls the apostasy, open public defiance against the God of heaven. Then it goes on to talk about the results of that. And then in chapter 12, in verse 11, is about the clearest way it says it. And from the time that the daily sacrifice, tamid is the Hebrew word, the normal daily sacrifice, is taken away, some of the Greek translations of the Old Testament use the form of apostasia, taken away. So this is the act of breaking the covenant that he made with Israel and allowing them a return to their many of the religious practices that they are restricted to right now. And he's going to take them away. He's going to rebel against them, apostatize against them. And the abomination of desolation is set up again. They're tied together. There shall be 1,290 days. Well, Jesus grabs hold of all of this because, as I like to say, he's the one who inspired Daniel to write all of that. And when he's presenting the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, and he's capturing a lot. And part of the thing is this is just a few days before his arrest and trial and death. Time is pretty limited. There's a lot of events going on those last several days. He has a lot to accomplish in a very short period of time. So I think that's one reason why he summarizes a lot of prophetic information from the Old Testament prophets into this discourse on the Mount of Olives. But he gives us a clue in verse 15 where he says, therefore, when you see, it's something that's going to be seen, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. Well, he's sitting on the Mount of Olives looking across the Kidron Valley at the temple. And that temple had a place called the holy place. And what else are you going to call it at that point? So that gives us a clue as to the temple idea in 2 Thessalonians 2. Of course, we would say the holy place in 24:15 was no longer a real holy place because he had just at the end of chapter 23 said, your house is left unto you desolate. There's that word desolate again. And so even though they were in rebellion against God, in defiance against their Messiah, and in a in kind of a way of their own, committing abominations of desolation with their temple practices, that he chased them out with a cat of nine tails, a whip, but he still calls it the holy place because he's looking at that building, and that's what they called it. Doesn't mean it was a holy place in the sense that God looked at it as holy, although in a sense the word holy being set apart, that was a set apart place for the Lord's use, but it was not holy in fact at this point. But it was still called the holy place. It was still called the temple. You know, verse 1, Jesus went out and departed from the temple. Well, was it really a functioning temple in God's eyes in the sense that he was accepting what they were doing? No, they were in rebellion. They were in sin. But they still used those terms to describe that building and that place. And I think that's what Paul does in 2 Thessalonians 2, even though we say the church is the temple today. But he's using it in the way it was used in the first century by Jewish believers. They still called it the temple. And they understood that it was not being honored by God anymore in the sense that he wanted it to be. So, anyway, another sidetrack, but I think I made the point. But then he says, whoever reads, let him understand. And a lot of commentators say this is Matthew inserting his own recommendation here. No, this is Christ. Christ is telling us, telling his disciples, if you want to know more about this event called the Abomination of Desolation, go over and study Daniel, because Daniel is the one who develops it in the most complete way. And so it's just kind of shorthand here. We're saying go spend time in Daniel and you'll understand what I'm talking about better. So this timestamp in verse 15 of Matthew 24, when you see the abomination, it leads directly to then of verse 21, then there shall be great tribulation. The middle of Daniel's 70th week, the covenant is broken. The abomination settles that fact. He declares himself as God. He turns on Israel to destroy them. He captures Jerusalem. I mean, where is the abomination of desolation? Where does it take place? It's in Jerusalem. So he has captured Jerusalem. He's going to make it his capital city to try to say that he's more powerful than Christ, because that is the city of the great king, Psalm 48:2. Jerusalem is the city of God. And now the Antichrist is captured, Satan working with him. So they both feel like they have overcome God. So then there should be great tribulation. And then it leads directly to verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. And then Christ returns in verse 30 and 31. The resurrection and rapture happens. There is a particular time order with these time stamps of then and when and after. And you just kind of follow that language through Matthew 24, and I think you'll develop a pretty good general framework or outline of the how and the when and the what of the last 3.5 years, certainly. Mark 13 and 14, this is just Mark's version of the same discourse on the Mount of Olives, but he says it slightly differently. Mark 13 and 14. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, where it ought not, the Antichrist had agreed to let them have access to that place for an observance of their religious practices, however that, whatever that will look like. To the Jews, it will be an approval of a return to their religious system the way they want it to. Uh, and so he goes into the place he agreed to let them do that. And that's why it says he's standing where it ought not. Let the reader understand. Then we go now, I've been referring to this quite a bit, 2 Thessalonians 2 in verse 4. Got to read verse 3 to pick up the context. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless two things happen. The falling away comes first. The man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. So this apostasy, the falling away, and the revealing of the son of man of sin uh, are two events that happen at the same time, just like the two events of verse 1 happen at the same time. The coming, the parousia of Christ, and our gathering together to him, which is the resurrection and rapture combined. So the two events of verse 1 will not happen until the two events of verse 3. That's why the word first. What comes first, verse 3 or verse 1? Well, it seems that verse 3 comes first, and then verse 1 happens afterwards. Then it goes on to describe this man of sin in verse 4, who opposes and exalts himself, the self-exalting one, self-promoting one, the greatest example of selfish pride that the world has ever known, who opposes and exalts. So by exalting himself, he's opposing God. So that's why I say I think this is the commentary to what the apostasy is in verse 3. And I know it's a very minority position. Most make it a falling away of people from the truth and all of that. But in a sense, he is opposing who God is. He is exalting himself above God. It's the ultimate defiant act that a human can do. It is a rebellion. We make that apostasy in verse 3 a falling away. So we make it humans, and there will be humans who fall away from the truth. I don't deny that at all. But it's triggered by something, and it's triggered by this rebellion, is maybe the word I would use. Instead of falling away, he's the great rebel against all that is God, called God. So opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God. And in that day, that they would think of that building. It was still standing, it hadn't been destroyed yet. Uh, and he's talking about the true God, and the true God had a temple built. Now, God may not have been pleased at this time with what was going on in the temple, but it was still a temple that had been built to God. So people in that day would understand, all the different gods of the major cities of that time. All the major cities of that time had a major god, like Diana and Ephesus and so forth. So everyone would know, because Jews were scattered all over the place, that when the Jews talked about the temple of their God, they would immediately think of the temple in Jerusalem. So I don't have a problem with this. I don't try to force this to mean the church or anything like that. I mean, how would he sit in local churches? It'd be pretty difficult. So that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. That's the Paul's way of describing, without using the exact term, the abomination of desolation is 2 Thessalonians 2 and 4. And by the same token, John does kind of the same thing in Revelation 13. He doesn't call it the abomination of desolation, but he describes the same kind of thing. Verse 5 and 6 of Revelation 13. He was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. He was given this mouth ultimately by God. God allowed it. But the power behind this mouth speaking great things and blasphemies is Satan having been cast down. And his head was mortally wounded in verse 3. The Antichrist, his deadly wound, was healed. So right in the middle, these things are happening. His death and resurrection event leads to him exponentially multiplied versions of his own pride and arrogance is now heightened to the greatest degree, partly because of he views his own death and resurrection event as proof that he has all power, and then he is empowered by Satan himself. So this makes him what is described in verse 5. He was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. He was given authority to continue 42 months. So we know this death and resurrection event happened right in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God. See, this is John's version of 2 Thessalonians 2:4. To blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. So he's defying in an arrogant, open, public act uh, everything against God and against anything connected to God, including his people. So I wanted to include 2 Thessalonians 2:4 and Revelation 13:6, even though they don't use the exact term abomination of desolation. They do describe the attitude behind it by this man of sin. And so I think it was important to include them to round out this idea of what the abomination of desolation is all about. So I hope you'll study these more on your own. Hope it stirs up some good thoughts. I hope that if you watch or listen to this, that you feel free to reply to my email address, howardrick05@gmail.com. May God bless.